a Livestream. Jan, du kannst jetzt starten.
Danke, Ursula. Ja, guten Abend von der Deutsch-Israelischen Gesellschaft, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Bonn. Mein Name ist Jan Eikenbohm. Zugeschaltet ist meine Vorstandskollegin Ursula Schmidt und unser Gast Dan Schiftan. Das ist die zweite von 4 Videokonferenzen mit dir, Dan. Dein heutiger Vortrag widmet sich der Sicherheitslage Israels, vor allem mit Blick auf den Iran und die Palästinenser. Als Direktor des Zentrums für nationale Sicherheitsfragen an der Universität Haifa und als Berater der israelischen Regierung bist du dafür ein ausgewiesener Sachverständiger. Und wir freuen uns auch, dass du über das Abkommen zwischen Israel und den Vereinigten Arabischen Emiraten sprechen willst. Wie in unseren vorherigen Konferenzen können unsere Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer Fragen an Dan über die Kommentarfunktion in YouTube stellen. Wir leiten die Fragen dann weiter. Dan wird Englisch sprechen, aber die Fragen können sowohl in Englisch als auch in Deutsch gestellt werden. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will discuss today the security perspective of Israel, but I will go beyond military questions or the issues that are immediately being discussed in the press to go back even before the establishment of the State of Israel and give us some broad picture about the nature of the security problems and only then discuss the specific issues that Israel is facing today. Israel is in a very unique situation. I don't think we have had any democratic, open society being at war for 140 years. I mean, since the very beginning of the Zionist project, you've had Arab opposition to the project, violent Arab opposition to the Zionist project. And whereas it started more locally inside Palestine or Eretz Israel at the end of the 19th century, during the beginning of the 20th century, and only later became a state matter after the establishment of the State of Israel, the question of the physical survival was always very important. Now, as long as the British were here, simply destroying the Jewish community by physically killing everybody was not an option because the British would have prevented it. But what Arab violent opposition to Israel meant in the early days was an attempt to make the life of the very small Jewish community here so impossible that Jews will not want to come, and those who will come will leave because the circumstances were very, very difficult. The Arabs were trained in fighting because even civilians had weapons, and it was customary to have intertribal fightings and fightings between villages and fighting with robbers and so on. So they were trained to do it. The Jews were not. They came here without any kind of experience, and it was a tiny Jewish community. And it took a while before the Jews understood that they have a major security problem that they have to deal with in a broad sense covering the whole country. It was only in 1929, after Arabs massacred Jews throughout the country, including Jews that they have always tolerated, namely ultra-Orthodox Jews in the holy cities, particularly in Hebron. And it is only in 1929 when the Jews fully realized that they must organize on a scale of the whole country, not just every settlement, every village, every town defending itself, but to do something broader. And this is when the Haganah was established. This was the most important Jewish armed force until the establishment of the State of Israel. But even that was a militia of people who would sometimes train a little bit, sometimes be prepared to counter Arab attacks, but it was not capable for a long period of time to take up beyond something of an Arab armed group here or there. But something very important that also happened in 1929 is for the first time the Jews' understanding that the idea that some of them had, remember, many of them were socialists, and their perception was, we will benefit the Arabs here in Palestine. Their infant mortality will drop dramatically. Their economic income will increase. We are not coming to replace them. We're coming to live next to them. Why should they oppose us? They should even welcome us coming. And it is only in 1929 that some of the most important leaders realized that as long as the Jews are here as a collective, the Arabs will try not only to undermine the Jewish entity, but even to fight it physically, and that they need to defend themselves. And between 1936 and 39, what the Arabs called the Great Arab Revolt, at that time, you had confrontations on a more major scale, but here the Jews worked with the British against Arab terrorism. And in the final analysis, in 1939, this subsided. But Ben-Gurion and some others understood we need to prepare ourselves from a very long period, and certainly for a crucial period of confrontation that could be not only a confrontation with the Arabs living here, but also the arms of Arab states surrounding Israel, trying to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel. And we had a war in 1948 where Arab armies came here trying to destroy the Jews, openly saying that their objective is a total destruction. Sometimes they even said slaughter. Sometimes they even said throwing the Jews into the sea. They used a variety of terms, but the idea was certainly to destroy the Jewish state. This was something that they all agreed about. And we need to understand the security situation, not only in terms of what do you do militarily against your enemy, but also what does it do to the society. Remember, Zionism is first of all a revolution in the life of the Jewish people. We mentioned some of these things last week. Let me perhaps recapture one element here that is extremely important. If the Jews are trying to build their nation and to build their society, and they're being attacked, they must defend themselves. And what we know from the history of all nations is that when you have a war, people become much more mobilized in terms of looking much less for personal freedoms, and they rally around the flag and they go to the battlefield and they try to save their lives. And this is fine when a democratic nation does it and they have a war and they win the war and then they can resume civilian life. Here, the situation was dramatically different. Here is a war, and in a while there will be another war, and another war, and another war, and another war, and another war. In other words, you know that this is something that may not end because you have a lot of grievances against you, you have a lot of violence in the region you live in, and you need to survive in a region where even Arabs kill each other among themselves. Forget about Israel for a moment. Forget about the Jewish state. Look at how they treat each other. And ask yourself, what does it mean not only for your army, you have to have a very strong army, not only for your defense expenditure, you have to spend on defense much more than other democratic nations, but also what does it cost your society? How do you maintain your democratic system? And here is the interesting thing. You don't only have to maintain a democratic system, you have to create a democratic system. Because the overwhelming majority of the Jews who came here came from non-democratic countries. And they wanted to establish here a democratic regime, and usually democracy is being undermined by war and conflict and confrontation. So how do you build a democracy from scratch, from nothing, from very little background of the people who came to live here, and that it will not only survive wars, but it will continue to develop during wars and become more pluralistic during wars. Because if you manage to defend yourself, but what you're defending is not a democratic country, then why should you defend it? If the Jewish state will look like the Arab state, only it will be Jewish, but it will be equally totalitarian, without personal freedoms, what's the point of having it in the first place? Would the people be prepared to fight for such an entity? Is it important enough for them? So, since from the Jewish point of view, the option of not being an open, pluralistic democracy was a non-existent option, you need to do two things at the same time. You need to be tough enough to fight a war and another war and another war and always be prepared for the next war, and at the same time to build a strong, pluralistic society. And look at the last 100 years or more, and you will see that in terms of the challenge did not change. It's easier today because Israel is much stronger than ever in the past. It is easier today because the Israeli democracy is already established, but we're still facing the same thing. Namely, how do you defend your country from very strong and hostile neighbors that constantly want to destroy you, and at the same time build a modern, pluralistic, open society? So let's take it from the beginning of the State of Israel and see where we are now. In 1948, we had something that very few people know, not because it's a secret, but because very few tend to study the 1948 war. What Israelis and many others think about the 1948 war is very simple. 7 Arab states were fighting against Israel, 5 Arab armies invaded Israel, Israel fought the Arabs and emerged victorious from the war. But this is a very simple-minded portrayal of the war. If you go deeper, you will find something that is very relevant today. In 1948, Israel has a strategic alliance with the Hashemites in Transjordan, what later came to be the country of Jordan that we know today, but the same family, the Hashemite family. And actually, when you look at the big contours of the war, it is Israel and Jordan against Egypt and the Palestinians, with the Syrians and the Lebanese playing a secondary role in this war. And even then, we managed to find in the Arab world the divisive element, to use the divisive element in the Arab world, to use the Egyptian-Jordanian rivalry in order to work with the Jordanians against the Egyptians, with the Jordanians against the Palestinians. So when you think today about having peace with Egypt, when you think about what has happened with the United Arab Emirates only a few days ago, when you think about Israel trying to create secret alliances that don't come out in the open with, say, Saudi Arabia, finding the common interest, one of the main instruments for Israel to survive is not only to have a strong army and to win battles, but also to have a political structure where a common interest between Israel and some of the Arab states help us to fight other Arab states. And when we're speaking about today's situation, Israel joining forces with the majority of Sunni Arab states against Iran, a Shiite Muslim non-Arab country, and some Shiite elements in the Middle East who work with Iran and other enemies of Israel, radical Sunni elements who fight Israel. And to complicate it, if it is not complicated enough, we're not only having to fight directly with Iran, but indirectly with the Muslim brothers, where Turkey is a very important element, and Turkey is also a member of NATO. So we're speaking about an extremely complex structure. And when you're facing a complex structure, and when you're facing many countries who are your declared enemies, it's bad news, because a lot is directed against Israel, but it's also good news because you can exploit the divisions inside the camp that declares itself as the enemy of Israel, and you can use one against the other. In 1948, we used the Jordanians against the Palestinians, the Jordanians against the Egyptians. Today, we are trying to use the animosity between the countries in the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf and Iran. So look at the security problem in this perspective. Now, between 1948 and 1977 or 79, we had a major conflict, particularly with one country, with Egypt. Egypt is the largest Arab country, the most cohesive Arab country. We're speaking today about 100 million Egyptians. We're speaking about a very populated country. We are speaking about perhaps the only thing in the Arab world that has always been there and will probably be there for the foreseeable future. Egypt is there for 5,000, 7,000 years. There is something called Egypt historically, whereas Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, these are constructions that are less than 100 years old. These are constructions that don't really have peoples. There is no such thing as the Syrian people. There are the Alawites, there are the Sunnis, there are others. In Iraq, you have Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds. And what makes them Iraqi is not very deep. Egypt and Egyptians have always been there. And Egypt was the main enemy of Israel from the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 until the end of the 1970s. And most of our big wars, 48, 67, 73, also the war of attrition of 69, 70, but primarily these three big wars, and the existential threat to Israel had to do primarily with Egypt. Now, Israel became stronger over the years, but Egypt was still a very, very formidable enemy. And when the Egyptians and the Syrians attacked us together in 1973, Israel had a major problem. It came out of this problem. It was strong enough not only to survive the war, but to emerge much, much, much stronger than Egypt and Syria. But we had a very serious problem. And the number one challenge of Israel and the number one security objective of Israel over decades between its establishment and the end of the 1970s, in these 30 years, the most important security objective of Israel is to get Egypt out of the war, namely to strike a separate agreement with Egypt, to give the Egyptians something that will satisfy them so that they will be willing to stop making war against Israel. And once Egypt is out of the equation, the rest of the Arab world is very, very, very weak. It can be a nuisance. It can be a major nuisance. It can be a nuisance directed against the Israeli population, not against the Israeli army, but it is not a threat of the magnitude that we have seen. So when Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt in 1973, and when the Iraqi army was destroyed by two confrontations with America in the 90s and the beginning of this century, Actually, there was no major threat to Israel, and Syria, that was the most immediate threat, understood that alone it cannot threaten Israel and was very careful to keep its own border quiet, its own border with Israel quiet. And since that time, the situation of Israel only improved from a security point of view vis-à-vis the Arab world, but at the same time, we had the revolution in Iran. And since then, after the Iranians came out from the Iraq-Iran war and other difficulties, we are now having by far the most dangerous enemy, the Iranians. And the situation today is that Israel is facing more than anything else, Iran as an enemy. A, because we're speaking about a local power. B, because unlike the Arab world, where the society is very weak, where the failure of the Arab political structure and the structure of the Arab world is very weak. It's failing in practically every aspect. The Arab world is one of the worst failures that you can possibly imagine, certainly compared to the opportunities that they had. Iran has a very deadly combination that Germans should be aware of a very impressive society with a very barbaric regime. What was the danger of Hitler in the previous century? That he managed to mobilize a very capable society for a very radical and barbaric policy and conduct of war. We have something similar with Iran. On the one hand, the Iranian society is very impressive. On the same side, Iran and Israel are the only two countries who have a bright future in this region. One day, when the Iranians get rid of this barbaric regime that they're having today, Israel and Iran can be the best of friends. The Iranian society produces science and technology and even a measure of pluralism in spite of the mullahs, but it is mobilized in the hands of a barbaric regime. Now, here is an interesting paradox. We are speaking about the weakness and the failure of the Arab world, and on the face of it, it should be good news for Israel. We are surrounded by weak countries that cannot threaten us because they're weak. But actually, it is bad news. It is bad news because the Iranians are strong and they look at the Arab world and they say, we can take over the Arab world. We are strong, the Arabs are weak. We are willing to use brutal measures. We are very effective in using proxies, so we don't have to do it ourselves. We will mobilize people like Hezbollah who will do it for us, or Shiite militias that will do it for us, or the Houthis in Yemen who will do it for us. And we will dominate the Middle East. And when we dominate the Middle East, and we are in charge of the oil of the Middle East and of the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, so we will be the focal point of Islam and the enormous riches of oil and the control of important countries and the fear of everybody who knows how brutal we are, we can become a regional power that radiates its power, that projects its power even on the global scene, threatening Europe, for instance. So Iran has very far-reaching ambitions, and there is nobody to stop them. Nobody to stop them because Russia is not interested in mobilizing for it. China is not interested in mobilizing it against it. America is tired of military involvement in the Middle East, and Europe is a non-entity. So who can stop the Iranians? Only one country, Israel, because it has a combination of the abilities, the strengths, the motivation, and the determination to do it. If the Middle East is dominated by Iran, this threatens the existence of Israel. Israel was not facing a direct, immediate existence threat since 1948. If the Iranians dominate the Middle East, we will again have not a potential existential threat that we always have, but an immediate operative existential threat because of the power of Iran. So Israel must prevent it, whatever the cost. If the cost is war, war. Israel must prevent it before it materializes, because when it materializes and there is war, the defense of Israel will be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So Israel is strong enough to do it, determined enough to do it, and credible in the eyes of the Arabs who are afraid of Iran to do it. The last is the most important for the understanding of what has been happening in the last days. The Arab world know that the only thing that can save them from Iranian domination is the power of Israel. And therefore, Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Kuwait and Bahrain and Morocco, in spite of the fact that geographically it is very far remote, but it is also an Arab regime that is threatened by the Iranians. All of them know not only that having good relations with Israel is important, but also that a strong Israel benefits them. And therefore, not only are they not against Israel becoming strong, actually, they depend on the strength of Israel to defend them from Iran, because Israel is motivated to do it. And unlike everybody else, also is determined to do it. You see, determination is as important as military power. If we have a huge military power, but you're determined to do nothing, like Barack Obama, like Jimmy Carter, then you become like Europe. You become a non-entity. Nobody must take you seriously. You don't exist on this strategic level. But if you have both the power and the determination, because your motivation is so strong, then the Arabs will rely on you. Now let me speak about the Iranian threat, then we'll discuss a little bit the Palestinian threat, and then we will come back to the overall perspective. The Iranian threat. What Iran is trying to do, realizing that Israel is the only country that can stop it, is to present Israel with such a threat that Israelis will not be willing to risk confrontation with Iran. Let me give you an example. If Iran dominates Jordan the way it dominates today already Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Yemen, then from an Israeli point of view, we are in an unacceptable situation. And therefore, if the Iranians are trying to take over Jordan, my guess is Israel will take military action to prevent it. How do you deter Israel from taking military action to prevent a takeover of Jordan? You present Israel with hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles that are accurate, long-range, heavy payload, so that in spite of the fact that Israel has the best missile defense system in the world, actually the only country in the world that has a full defense, a full missile defense program is Israel. No other country in the world can defend itself from missiles on a major scale throughout its territory, only Israel. And it's a very, very good system. But this very good system can be saturated by hundreds of thousands of missiles. And even if you kill 40% of them, or 60% of them, or 80% of them, still the 10, 20% of it can bring many, many casualties in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, and the electric plants and the water plants and the industry, and they can do it over a long period of time. And in this long period of time, Israel will not be destroyed, but the Israeli success story will be destroyed. And the Iranians are trying to build this infrastructure to tell the Israeli decision makers, when we take over Jordan, don't do anything, otherwise Tel Aviv will not be able to function. And this is something that you need to prevent before it happens. And the Iranians are trying to reach this point by A, making the Lebanese rockets of Hezbollah, 130,000 of them, accurate. There is a major difference between statistic missiles and rockets and accurate missiles. So they're trying to make them accurate. They're trying to bring into Syria tens of thousands of missiles and establish them in Syria near the Israeli border. And they try to do it in Western Iraq, not far from Israel, not as far as Iran is from Israel. And they're trying to do it without confronting Israel. Namely, we just bring in missiles, okay? We just provide the air defense system to the missiles. And what Israel is doing, a number of times every week, we are at war. Don't make any mistake about it. It's a low intensity war, but it's a war. What Israel is doing a few times a week is to destroy these bases again and again and again and again and again. The Iranians are trying to build them, we destroy them a number of times a week with missiles, with aircraft, with other means. We are trying to destroy it, and it's going quite well. And the Iranians are not willing to respond. We are waging war against Iran, and the Iranians don't respond. Why don't they respond? 4 major reasons. A, the battle is near Israel and far from Iran. We have a military advantage. B, the Russians who control Syria allow us to do it. They don't confront us with their very advanced surface-to-air missiles because the Russians don't want us to undermine the Assad regime. So what is important for them, we don't touch. And what is important for us, they don't touch. Number 3, we are not alone. The Arab states are mostly with us. They don't have to be with us militarily. We don't need them militarily, but we need them politically. We don't want the United States to have the choice between supporting the Jews and the Arabs, because they can support both Israel and the Arabs at the same time, confronting a country who's their enemy anyhow, Iran. And the 4th and most important element is that Iran knows that as long as Trump is president, the United States will support Israel. So at the moment, we are not having a war because Biden is not a president. If Biden will be president and he will be as impotent as Europe, maybe the Iranians will change their calculations. But at the moment, they don't want to confront us. So we make war against them and they don't respond. Now, do they do certain things directly? Yes, they tried a cyber attack against Israeli water. They tried to poison it with chlorine. We responded, so they say, by immobilizing important parts of a very important port of Bandar Bandar Abbas, actually paralyzing part of it, again, through cyber attacks, so they say. Here and there, they try something, they usually fail. It's on a small scale. They have lost their most talented commander, Soleimani, killed by the Americans. So at the moment, this is the case. And this is the real challenge. Palestinians and everything else is a footnote compared to the Iranian challenge. So when Israel does not respond in Gaza, it is only because you don't want to waste your energies on something so unimportant when by far the greatest danger comes from Iran. So that's one chapter. The second chapter is the Palestinian chapter. Now, we're discussing it here from a security point of view. It also has another point of view of why is it bad for the Israeli society to control over a very long period of time a hostile society living in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. That's a different consideration. We can discuss it separately. But as a security problem, the Palestinians are constantly a problem without a solution, because any kind of compromise with the Palestinians is impossible. It was impossible in the past, it is impossible at the present and in the near future, and unless something revolutionary happens, it will also be impossible in the more distant future. You need to have a revolution among the Palestinians. They must become Norwegians, or at least Jordanians, in order to discuss a compromise. It is not an option. They say so openly. What they demand is ridiculous. They demand us to help them to destroy Israel. This is ridiculous. So they are an enemy. Palestinians are an enemy. Now, this Palestinian enemy is divided into two sections. And by the way, they hate each other like only tribal societies can have intertribal confrontations. In Gaza, you have a radical Muslim Brotherhood entity that gets billions of dollars and puts every cent of it into war with Israel. They have no interest whatsoever in giving their children a better future. When they fight Israel, they don't say that they want better conditions or something here or there. They openly admit that they want to kill all, not only Israelis, but all Jews. They are anti-Semites openly. In their ideological documentation, they mention the protocols of the Elders of Zion. They speak about the Jews being their enemies. And with the exception of some stupid European journalists, everybody knows that it's impossible to reach any kind of compromise with them, because they openly say that what they want is our destruction. And this is a problem without a solution. When people speak about the two-state solution, they're being ridiculous, not because of the two states part, but because of the solution part. The assumption that you can find a solution with a people that openly say that killing our children is more important for them than giving their children a better future is something that is completely impossible. In the West Bank, they sometimes pretend to be different. In the Gaza Strip, they don't even bother to pretend. So here we have a confrontation that is primarily military. It has no solution. From time to time, we will have to hit them, and then we will get 2 or 3 years of relative tranquility, and then we will have to hit them again. Is it a good situation? No. Is it the only realistically achievable situation? Yes. In the West Bank, it's a bit more complicated because they pretend to negotiate. But here is an interesting thing. The last time we had negotiations with them in 2008, they admitted openly, and I'm speaking about Saeb Erekat. Saeb Erekat is the negotiator for the Palestinians for more than 20 years. And Saeb Erekat says, we got 100% of the territory that we require, but we want the right of return. And then he says, in Camp David, in the year 2000, we got 90%. Now we got 100%. So as long as we wait, we get more. So why should we hurry? Then he wants 120%, 200%, because when they speak about the right of return, they speak about turning Israel from a Jewish state to an Arab state, namely to destroy Israel. Okay? So there is no compromise with them, and no Israeli government will even offer what Olmert already offered in 2008, certainly not more. So an agreement of a historic compromise with the Palestinians is completely out of the question. The chances can be defined digitally. It is zero, okay? Zero chances for a negotiated agreement because of the Palestinian position. They were already offered everything they claim that they want, including the partitioning of Jerusalem, including 100% of the scope of the territory Jordan lost in 1967, not the Palestinians, they never had a state. They want to get what the Jordanians lost, and Olmert offered them with land swaps, 100% of them. No Israeli government can offer more. No Israeli government will offer even what Olmert offered in 2008. So the chances are absolutely zero. When the chances are zero, the question is, what do you do? Some Israelis say, this is our land, we want to remain there forever. Other Israelis say, we are willing to withdraw, but also only for peace. And a third category of Israelis, and I belong to this category of Israelis, say, peace is not an option. If we wait for it, we will wait forever, and the chances are zero. So let us get out unilaterally after imposing against the will of the Palestinians what we need in order to be secure. So our reward from getting out will be dual. A, getting out itself is a reward. I don't want to control them. I don't want to waste my energy with any kind of contact with the Palestinians. I want to be cut off from them completely. I don't want them to see me, and I don't want to see them. I want to live separately from them. I have 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. They're the citizens of Israel. This is not the same category. I'm speaking about the Palestinians in the West Bank. And concerning the Palestinians of the West Bank, I'm willing to withdraw from the overwhelming majority of the West Bank as long as they cannot threaten me. Not that they don't want to threaten me. I'm not willing to have my security based on their goodwill. I want them to prevent them physically from being able to threaten Israel. For instance, to join force with the Iranians, to invite the Iranians into the West Bank 12 miles from Tel Aviv. No way. I will not let them have it. So some people, I belong to them, consider the possibility of applying Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley that will cut them off from the radical hinterland and thereby reduce dramatically their danger and then withdraw unilaterally from the majority of the West Bank. In my view, in the final analysis, this is what Israel will do. But if you look at today's situation, you will find that this question of how can we disengage from the Palestinians without threatening our security is the most important question. Let me wrap it up, finish my presentation by coming back to the overall view. Our challenge is a dual one. On the one hand, to be strong enough to defend ourselves against the Iranian strategic threat, against Palestinian terrorism, against any radical force who will try to attack us from Lebanon or what have you, but also to maintain the combination that we already have between Sparta against our enemies and essence inside Israel and with our friends also in the Arab world. Namely, very tough, very strong, very determined against our enemies, and at the same time, very soft inside Israel, and with those like the Egyptians and the Jordanians who have signed a peace treaty with us, who are behaving in a way that is not threatening Israel, who are even helping us to deal with other threats. And as long as we maintain this combination, we are basically in good shape. Let me stop here and open the floor for any kind of questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very strong rhetoric, as always. We have never known you otherwise. And I believe we already have some questions from the floor. Ursula, is that true?
Yes, we do have indeed some questions here. Altogether, it's 4 questions, so I'd like to tackle them one by one. The first question is about the view of European politics. The question is it possible to change the view of European politics? In quotation marks, he says, if I just wish enough, it must happen. Towards Iran?
Friede, Freude, Eierkuchen. I think this is the... I don't think so. European elites, and let me be very specific here. I think there is a major difference between European elites and the majority of the population in Europe. And another important distinction is between the European Union, which is hopeless, and individual European states that you can discuss issues with. Europe has a problem since the First World War. The traumatic experience, if you want to understand Europe today, study the First World War, much more important than the Second World War. The trauma of the First World War, by the way, a terrible trauma, is something that the Europeans have not been able to process until this very day. And Europe lives in a kind of la-la land where, again, as this person who asked the question said, wishing for things makes them come true. It is, let us have positive thoughts and then things will be nice. We will have a beautiful dialogue with people. Look, you're trying to look at the enormous success of Europe inside Europe itself and to project it to other parts of the world. Because I'm very critical about Europe, let me say 2 positive things about Europe. A, every value that I'm proud of, I've learned from the Europeans, and I'm sure I have a lot more to learn from the Europeans. B, the greatest achievement of mankind in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is turning Europe from a slaughterhouse into a peaceful continent. People should historically remember not only the 2 world wars, but the 30-year war, to know how brutal Europe could be. And the Europeans have left it behind them, and it is inspiring. It is beautiful. I have enormous respect for it. And then the Europeans come, look at the Middle East, and tell Israelis, why don't you do in the Middle East what we've done in Europe? So let me remind you how this happened in Europe, okay? It happened in Europe when Nazism was brutally destroyed. It is not that one day Hitler came to the conclusion, living in peace is a good idea, so let me sit with Churchill and we will reach an understanding. No. He was destroyed, his country was destroyed, his system was destroyed, and then the others could come together. So that's one distinction. We can't destroy the whole Arab world, and we will not let the Arab world destroy us. So it is simply irrelevant. And then, another thing, Europeans always had something in common. Look, when Britain and Germany were at war with each other, the BBC, and London was bombarded, the BBC started every day its sendings, its broadcasts, with a musical quotation from a German composer. They had ta-ta-ta-tam, which is also in Morse code, the letter V, okay? So one thing. Another thing, on both sides of the front, they were singing the same song. Unter der Laterne beiden großen Tor, für dich Lili Marlene, okay? You have something in common, you're all Habsburgs. There is something in common. What do we have in common with the Arabs? Thank God, nothing. Nothing, absolutely nothing, thank God. What do you want? A democracy like in Syria, human rights like in Libya, scientific innovation like in Yemen? What is there on the collective level in the Arab world that Israel should be part of? Show me one thing that we should want to adopt. Individual Arabs can be great people. I know hundreds of them, and many of them very impressive, and I've learned a lot from them. But as a collective, do we have anything in common? Thank God, nothing. People speak about the Abrahamic religions. That's very nice. It means zero, nothing, absolutely nothing. Because the question is not what the Quran says. By the way, the Quran says that this land belongs to the Jews, was promised by God to Moses. Okay? So what? It is the interpretation of their religion. So the point that we speak a Semitic language means zero. The point that we are descendants of Abraham means zero in today's Middle East. We have nothing in common with our environment. So what you can't have a Middle Eastern identity that will bring together Saddam Hussein, Assad, Arafat, and Amos Oz. It's a bit difficult. This is something that you really must have a sense of humor to be a European in order to say it seriously. It's a joke for anybody who lives in the real world, not in La La Land. It's a joke. Europeans capitulate. That's what they do. Okay? They also do great things that we can learn from, but when it comes to being willing to defend themselves, they're not even willing to have a serious army. They're not willing to spend for an army. They expect the Americans to fight for them. They're not even willing to defend themselves. Look at the pitiful situation of European armies. Here and there an exception, but if you look at the overall picture, it is pitiful. So between Israel and Europe, you can't take the Europeans very seriously. Let me put it this way. Israel has with Europe a problem, but no dilemma. The problem is that when Europeans don't like what we do, they can punish us and it will hurt. No dilemma, because listening to the Europeans is not an option. If we would have listened to the Europeans, Israel would cease to exist. For instance, if we would have listened to the Europeans, Saddam Hussein would have had nuclear weapons, Assad would have had nuclear weapons, and Palestinian terrorists would roam the streets of Tel Aviv, because we stopped all this by using force in a way that is against Article 16, subsection B. Okay? I don't even care what it says. I don't care. You believe that there is such a thing as the international community. And then it boils down to the United Nations, where the barbarians and the authoritarians have the majority and the Europeans capitulate. So it's a joke. Do I have hopes about Europe? Not in the near future. Not in what I see. Again, on other levels, we're discussing security today. Can I learn from them a lot? Yes, I have learned a lot and want to learn a lot, and I'm very impressed. But when it comes to the discussion of security, which is what we're doing today, no way.
All
I'll
right.
try to be shorter for the next question. Sorry.
No problem. Our next question deals with the Iranian Atomic Control Treaty. Wasn't this a theater piece like Biedermann und die Brandstifter, where a house owner allows criminals to store gasoline under his roof, hoping it won't burn?
Yes, but I think that here there is more than stupidity. Stupidity is a part of it, but there is something much more fundamental. It happened when America got a European president. No wonder everybody loves Obama in Washington when he was president, because he's a European. But you can afford to be an American when there is a grown-up that defends you. Namely, Europe can afford to be Europe when America is America. When America defends Europe, Europe can play Friede, Freude, Eierkuchen. Okay, and speak about the international community and all this, ridiculous. It's nice in addition to force. I'm not saying abandon it, but it is not instead of hard power. You can have soft power after you have hard power. Let me perhaps use a very impolite term, but my excuse is that I'm quoting a president. When Kennedy said you have to reach the hearts and minds of people, Johnson is reported to have responded, once we've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. Okay? Soft power is very nice as long as you have hard power. If you don't have hard power, nobody takes you seriously. Because people will give up Shakespeare if they must, but if they have a British bomber over their head, they will treat it differently. Okay? So it's nice to have soft power, but it is not instead of a willingness to defend themselves. Vis-a-vis Iran, what Obama did is exactly appeasement. Now, since the term appeasement is occupied, he used terms like engaged or dialogue. But there is a very well-known Israeli sketch that speaks about an Arab teacher who teaches Hamlet in an Arab village, and he speaks about the possibility of, Hamlet having a monologue, and then he explains to the children the difference between a monologue and a dialogue. And he says the difference between a monologue and a dialogue is as follows. Whereas in the case of monologue, we have one person talking to himself. In the case of dialogue, two persons are talking to themselves. In the Middle East, this is the kind of dialogue you have with Saddam Hussein or with Arafat or with Assad or any other barbarian. Can you have a dialogue with King Hussein? Yes, we have it. Can we have a dialogue with Sisi? Yes, we have it. Are we now opening a dialogue with the United Arab Emirates? Yes, we are opening it. We will have a dialogue with them. But our enemies, and particularly the barbarians in Tehran, and I mean the regime here, the barbarians in Tehran, you can't have a dialogue. Let me only give one example about the nature of this regime. During the Iraq-Iran war, they were sending children into minefields so that they will explode the mines and the soldiers can go through. And every child had a plastic key tied to him, and they told him that this is the key to heaven, and once he dies, he goes to heaven, and this is the key to heaven. This is the kind of people we are speaking about. We are speaking about barbarians, okay, that behave barbarically to their own people. Look what the Basij is doing in Tehran when there are demonstrations. These are barbarians. And if you let barbarians have nuclear weapons, you are doing something very dangerous, not only for Israel, not only for the Middle East, but to the world in general. And the only way you deal with these people is by applying power, and not necessarily military power. I think that the economic pressure that the United States is putting today on Iran is extremely effective. Do you also need sometimes to use other means? Yes, but economic pressure is the lead element, but the Europeans want to do business. The Europeans have just opened the possibility for the barbaric Iranians to get weapons and to sell weapons when they voted against the United States in the Security Council. And Britain and France and Germany voted against the United States on this so that the Iranians can get weapons. If you think that this is the way, Israelis, the overwhelming majority of Israelis, will disagree.
All right, then we almost finished on it. No, not yet, but we have another question on the sanctions against Iran. The question is like, recently the UN, especially Russia and China, didn't want to prolong the sanctions against Iran. Germany and the Europeans abstained. Can you explain why China and Russia seem to support Iran? Only oil?
No, it's not only oil. They also don't want the United States to dominate the region. Look, China and Russia also are not interested in an Iranian nuclear weapon, but they want to embarrass the United States, to weaken the United States, to do business with Iran. China, I hope it will not materialize, but China has prepared an agreement with Iran that speaks about many billions of dollars that the Chinese will invest in Iran and also help them militarily in return for cheap oil. But I think it's a combination primarily of wanting to hurt the Americans, undermining the American position. And by the way, I think that if the Americans would come to the Chinese and they would say, you stop supporting Iran and we stop challenging your position in the South China Sea, the Chinese will be dancing in the streets. By the way, I don't think America should do it, but I'm saying this is for them a leverage. When you conduct a global policy, then you there is always linkage between different fronts of the global policy. So here we have a very strong element that is beyond the economics. It is part of a global politics. Concerning the European behavior in the Security Council, I've already responded. I never expected anything else of the Europeans. You can trust the Europeans to always be on the wrong side in every international organization. And this is one of the major value problems of Europe. Europe supports, not only when it comes to weapons and sanctions and so on, but Europe plays the game of the authoritarian and barbaric majority in international organizations, legitimizing what these regimes want to legitimize, the rationalization of it is the European position in these organizations, but actually they're buying their positions in meaningless organizations by legitimizing something that they very strongly reject. And I think it is not only a political mistake, it is also a moral mistake of the Europeans. But I wouldn't expect anything else of the Europeans. One of the reasons that Israelis never, ever, ever, ever trust Europeans is that they will betray you when you need them, and they will be against you wherever they find it more convenient. And then they have very little leverage because you can't trust them on anything. Europeans have an extremely bad image in Israeli public opinion, and I think it is very well justified. By the way, they are not rewarded by having a good image among Arab radicals because they realize that they cannot deliver because they're so weak.
Okay, our last question, I think you have already answered. It is about the role of China. Maybe you want to add something on the question, can a Chinese-Iranian strategic partnership pose a threat to Israel?
The simple answer is yes. If you combine the resources of China, the ability of China to provide modern technological assistance that the Iranians badly need, and the magnitude of the Chinese markets and the Chinese means, this is a major problem for Israel. I don't see at the moment China going in this direction because at the moment it is not willing to risk a confrontation with the United States. But if they come to the conclusion that the Americans will be impotent under Biden, then I think the Chinese policy will change as well. At the moment, they are waiting to see the outcome of the elections in the United States. By the way, the outcome of these elections is, even for Israel, more important than the outcome of Israeli elections, because it will dramatically determine what will happen on the international scene. And I'm sorry that we don't have today in the United States a third option of a president that you can support both in domestic policy and in foreign policy. Unfortunately, at the moment, you have two choices that are extremely problematic.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Ursula, I would just like to ask one question further, because the presidential elections in the United States are very close. What specifically, Dan, do you expect in case Joe Biden is voted into office? On the international policy level, but
in case
also,
what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you very well.
In case Joe Biden is elected to be the next president of the United States, what specifically, what do you believe would be the outcome? What would be the effect on the nuclear, I don't know what the Iran nuclear deal and so on? How would, what do you think what Joe Biden would actually do or not do? And how do you think the influence of the Democratic Party itself would be felt? There are people, some who call themselves the Squad, and one was actually twittering, I believe, it's all about the Benjamins, baby, when Congress voted pro-Israeli. I would like to hear views on that, because I believe in the German media, this is not really treated with due care.
First of all, I think in your question, you also have a strong part of the answer. The Democratic Party has changed in a very dramatic way. We've seen it in the past. if you remember George McGovern in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, right? If we have a Democratic Party that took a very, 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 very sharp turn following the so-called progressives. The progressives are radical and extremely dangerous for Israel, but also, I think, extremely problematic from an American point of view, both domestically and externally. And I'm afraid that Biden, that he himself is not hostile in any way and even has friendly elements. But remember, Obama in his own eyes genuinely was very friendly to Israel. He genuinely believed that he is friendly to Israel. This guy really didn't understand the world. I think this is the best way to describe his, he had the perspective of a community worker in Chicago, and not the perspective of somebody who can see the broad global realities. He was very intelligent, very sophisticated, knowledgeable, but without any kind of understanding. It's an excellent example of why intelligence is not the most important thing, and even knowledge is not the most important thing. I assume he is much more intelligent and knowledgeable than Ronald Reagan, okay, to give only one example. But in terms of his understanding of the world, he was completely off and wrong about everything he did on the international scene. Everything, or almost everything he did, was wrong, certainly in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the only good thing that he did was not to intervene in Syria, in the Syrian civil war. This, I think, was a wise decision. I doubt if it was taken for the right reasons, but I don't care. The decision was the right decision. Everything else in the Middle East was wrong. With Joe Biden, we will have this ridiculous European fixation with the Palestinians. And here's the point. These people really believe that if the Palestinian issue is settled, this will in any way change the Middle East. The impact of the Palestinians in the Middle East is exactly zero. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not only is it not the most important, not only is it not the major, it is not even a significant element of what's happening in the Middle East. If you tomorrow have peace between Israel and the Palestinians everlasting, or a terrible war between Israel and the Palestinians for a very long time, the impact on the Middle East will be exactly zero. It will not change the radicalism of Erdogan. It will not change the hegemonic ambitions of Iran. It will not change the question of, can Egypt feed itself? Is it sustainable economically? And many other countries in the Middle East, including recently Lebanon, are they sustainable economically? All the really important issues are completely unrelated to this issue. And yet, he will waste his time on it. He will fail inevitably on it. No matter what he does, he will fail, and he will be obsessed with it like the Europeans are obsessed with it without any strategic reason whatsoever. Concerning Iran, he will capitulate to Iran. I think we already have all the signs to it. He will, instead of focusing on what is really important, he will find something that looks significant in the short run and then try to present it as a success, but it will have no meaning whatsoever on the major issues concerning Iran. So I think that in foreign policy, it can only be, certainly in the Middle East, it can also only be a calamity. Also, I don't believe he will confront China. confronting China is tremendously important because we are at the last moment where the Chinese depend on the American market more than the Americans depend on China. And if the Americans don't confront China now, it will be too late later. Now, I'm not professionally qualified to tell you if what Trump is doing is the best thing or not. Maybe not, but he's at least trying. I don't think that Biden will even try. I don't think that he has the stomach for it. You need a stomach for it. You need to play a very hardball game there, and I don't think he has it in him.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dan. Ursula, I think we have another question coming in.
Yes, we do indeed have another question on the military cooperation between Israel and Germany. How do you evaluate the military cooperation between the two countries? Keywords are Israeli fighting squadron over Dachau.
Well, Israel fighting squadron over Dachau is an enormously important symbolic action. And I think Israelis should be grateful, and Jews around the world should be grateful for the German government not only very seriously, in my view, fighting anti-Semitism as much as they can, but also lending their support for this very important symbolic action. But this is not something, it helps that the relations between the Israeli and the German military are good, but this is a decision that is not taken in the military, it is taken much higher with the Kanzlerin, and I think we should all be grateful. I was very much moved by it, and I'm sure many Israelis will. But on top of it, the relations between the military establishments in Israel and in Germany are very good. I can tell you because I am also teaching senior German staff officers in Hamburg, in the Führungsakademie in Hamburg. And I speak a lot to German officers, and I find an enormous amount of goodwill. I've participated also in the German-Israeli strategic dialogue, which was held in Stauffenberger Straße in Berlin, and at the headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, with very, very friendly counterparts, a very open discussion, a very strong cooperation. I know that this sounds strange coming from me as a Jew, but I would like to see a much stronger German army, and I would like to see a much more favorable attitude of the German society to German soldiers. And I think that let me perhaps tell you one thing here that was very emotional for me. Last time we had in Israel, Yom HaShoah, the day where we commemorate the Holocaust, I brought to my class at Haifa University the German military attaché, and I asked him to come in uniform. I wanted my students to understand the difference between guilt and responsibility. This generation has no guilt. This generation is working with the Jews in a way that I respect very, very much. And it still has responsibility. And the Germans are willing to acknowledge this responsibility. So I think that this is something that we should all appreciate. And again, if the German army will be 5 times as strong, in spite of the fact that I have memories as a Jew of the Wehrmacht, I would very much support it because today Germany is an open democratic society which on the governmental level is not only not anti-Semitic, it is philo-Semitic. And I think that this is a good change of history given our very difficult history.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe you can, maybe you do have any recommendations of books regarding the issues which you have covered today for us?
The problem is that the books that I know are so specific that you need to read 75 of them to get a good. I don't know of a general book that I would recommend, at least not at the moment. Let me think about it, and I will perhaps speak about it in one of our next sessions. But perhaps I should write a book that will give this broad perspective. Unfortunately, we don't have something that is good enough in this department.
Fine. Thanks to you, Dan, and back to you, Jan.
Yeah. Thank you also from me, Dan. That was very impressive, as each of your lectures are. I'll just continue in German for our viewers. Das ist jetzt der zweite von 4 Vorträgen gewesen. Der nächste findet in der nächsten Woche um dieselbe Zeit statt, Donnerstag 18 Uhr. Dann wird Dan uns berichten über den Umgang mit der Pandemie in Israel und ihre wirtschaftlichen Folgen. Dann hat es auch eben schon angesprochen, das Engagement gerade auch der Bundesregierung gegen Antisemitismus. Wir haben morgen Vormittag um 10 Uhr ein Interview mit dem Antisemitismusbeauftragten Dr. Felix Klein und freuen uns auch da über Zuschauer. Dan sei herzlich gedankt für seinen guten, engagierten, lehrreichen Vortrag und wir freuen uns schon auf die nächste Woche. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Auch
Alles Gute.
Alles
Gute.
Thank you, Dan. See you next week.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. So